Hello, I've come to the site of the Battle of Jena-Auerstedt. In October 1806, 2 months after the dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire by the all-conquering French Emperor and the consequent demand that the Duke of Saxe-Weimar and Saxe-Eisenach join the new Confederation of the Rhine, the forces of Napoleon I of France and those of Friedrich Wilhelm III of Prussia faced each other across these hills. The eventual confrontation resulted in the decisive defeat of the Prussian army, which suffered something in the range of 10,000 casualties and the capture of 15,000 prisoners of war. Let's have a look inside the local museum. Outside it's calm. Nature has claimed back the land. If it weren't for the small monuments, a person could be forgiven for thinking that the battle never happened. And actually, there was something else that happened in Jena at the same time as the battle that is equally invisible to the naked eye, but which continues to have a significant impact on the world and on intellectual thought today. The something else lay in the work of Hegel. Given I want to try to pull the work of Weimar idealists together into a single narrative, to form an amalgamated definition of their approach to metaphysics, and thereafter to express this definition in a formal manner, then I must acknowledge that the most pivotal voice among the group was that of he who shook up the Enlightenment and its attentiveness to reason, in the same way that Napoleon crisscrossed Europe and shook up the political environment. Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel was a professor at the University of Jena at the time. He was putting the finishing touches to his work, The Phenomenology of Mind, even while the battle raged all around. And by the time it was finally done, the circumstances that had inspired it had changed. Lectures at the university were cancelled, and he and many other residents had little choice but to resort to finding employment elsewhere. His work was to prove to be a pinnacle of achievement in the development of idealistic thought and in the formulation of what I'm going to call the Weimar identity thesis. Yet it was also the end of an era. Hegel had studied in a Lutheran seminary in the University of Tübingen, where, by chance, he'd shared a room with Hölderlin and the 15-year-old Friedrich Schelling, already a quick-witted and perceptive young fellow. All three were to have a major impact on the early Romantic movement in the Dukedom of Saxe-Weimar, but Hegel came relatively late to the scene. He'd spent the best part of a decade tutoring the children of aristocratic families when finally he travelled to Jena in 1801, and even then only on Schelling's insistence. The younger man had helped him to get a lowly position as an unpaid lecturer. However, Hegel slotted into the community easily, and his work and his reputation advanced quickly. Goethe soon noticed him after the new arrival was seen to embrace the statement's morphology of plants and optics theories, and promoted him, although it was still another unpaid position. Indeed, Hegel had to rely on student donations for his income, and his funds were running low. He needed to publish his work to pay the bills, and he was on the brink of publishing when, in October 1806, Napoleon rode into town, literally. Actually, Hegel wrote how impressed he was at seeing the triumphant emperor on horseback parading through the streets. But he surely wasn't so happy when many of the students and professors, those who might have purchased his new book, took fright at the transformed political situation and fled the town. Nevertheless, Hegel remained focused on his work. He was determined to remain in Jena for one more winter so as to organise a publication of his book, and also because his landlady was pregnant with his child. Hegel's epistemology refutes Kant's invocation of epistemic limits. Indeed, he begins by pointing to contradictions in Kant whereby the claim we cannot know things in themselves implies, paradoxically, we must actually know something about the something in itself. Indeed, if Kant had argued that history should be subject to reason, Hegel countered with the argument that actually it's history that governs reason. He said transcendental cognition is not subject to a necessary and unchanging state at all. It too is contingent upon historical change, upon that which has been thought and discussed before receding into the forgotten past. Ideas, and even the idea of mind itself, are temporal entities.
Hegel had lived next door to Schelling for a while, and they published articles together. Even after his friend moved away with the estranged wife of Wilhelm Schlegel, Caroline, he continued to think highly of the younger man's work and used it for his own speculative theories, identifying the finite realm of nature and the infinite realm of mind as sharing the same source. Furthermore, Hegel wrestled with Fichte's subjective idealism and the difficulty it had with explaining contingent facts that are shared knowledge and therefore seemingly external to subjective selfhood.
After all, how could the motion of the planets and the cycle of the seasons be attributable to the individual ego? In the end, he concluded that there should be no difference between positing that a particular planet in space or a particular tree in the forest arises both from nature, from objective causal factors external to the mind, and also from factors perceived subjectively as internal to the mind, whereby both are different articulations of the same absolute existence. Hegel presented consciousness and being as subject to a process of ongoing development. He picked up on Fichte's idea of the dialectical fusion of thesis and antithesis to achieve synthesis, and added to this the idea that unity develops by way of the contradiction and negation of concepts. He said it's the very untangling of contradictions, so as to achieve a state of reconciliation, that makes the disclosure of truth possible. Indeed, Hegel argued that the process of transcendental reflection, whereby the mind is able to perceive a priori states, is not a one-off phenomena at all, but a general mechanism that exists in cognition for making consciousness confront itself. As the subject becomes self-reflective, it continually refutes its previous modes of thought. The entity of being, which is level 1 on my original chart of mind, is perceived by way of consciousness and mental states, levels 2 and 3, which change accordingly and thus reconstruct level 1, which causes further changes in levels 2 and 3. This ongoing dialectic process gives rise to ever more complex structures and deeper levels of understanding, and ultimately is oriented teleologically on the freedom and emancipation that comes with absolute knowledge. Finally, with his book in print, Hegel fled south and away from the ongoing difficulties in Prussia and the surrounding areas. He gained a position as a head teacher at a school in Nuremberg, which he was to hold for 8 years, and which, in striving to adapt his ideas for younger students, gave him the opportunity to define further the implications of the teleological imperative underpinning dialectical progress.
The development of absolute mind grounds everything, he told his students, including narrations of world history, including the development of ideas in all intellectual disciplines, and including literature, art, politics, and religion. In these two moments, the master gets his recognition through another consciousness, for in them the latter affirms itself as unessential, both by working upon the thing and, on the other hand, by the fact of being dependent on a determinate existence. In neither case can this other get the mastery over existence and succeed in absolutely negating it. Never mind his students. With a 2-year-old in the house, definitely he needed to find simpler ways of explaining his arguments than he'd managed in his Phenomenology of Mind, which makes for challenging reading. He needed to be able to say in plain words that all people could understand that they must rise above the duality of slave and master, whereby each looks to the other for recognition and identity. They must seek personal emancipation by way of the negation of social struggle. He needed to be able to say that mind is subjectivity, and subjectivity is the dialectic movement of reflective thought by way of its negation to the negative of the negation, and eventually to the full self-consciousness. The ongoing development of empirical knowledge is subject to the same process, although any attempt in science class to locate the absolute mind by way of empirical evidence, or in mathematics class by way of rational deduction, could only amount to empty formalism.
And so forth, until, now with 3 small children in the household, Hegel was appointed as a professor at the University of Berlin. He became a very influential figure and was able at last to articulate to other adults his position on art, politics and religion.
For Hegel, a human being and a human body is a mind. A mind, by definition, knows itself. It knows that it exists as a mind and that it's self-conscious. A mind defines itself by way of perceiving the world external to itself and by being able to distinguish between itself and that external world. However, it's a mind that is mind-dependent. It has no objective attributes which can define it as a mind independent of itself. It's a mind that incorporates features of the external world within itself, such as the physical senses, and such as a world that it experiences phenomenally. It's a mind that comes to know itself further by way of its reflection upon the external world, by way of its role in causal chains. It's a mind that develops steadily greater self-knowledge in tandem with the development of communal knowledge, which progresses through history and is bent on an eventual comprehension of its own intrinsic nature. It's a mind that can take great strides towards understanding of absolute freedom of absolute mind, not by way of science or mathematics, but by way of art. Art serves the development of the individual and absolute mind over time, because art enables contemplation on the mind itself, which in turn enables reflective assessment of an inner life of thought and imagination, and because art alone, besides introspective contemplation itself, renders the essential existence of the mind itself. Art arouses the imagination, overcoming the distraction of the senses, which in turn prepares the mind for an encounter with itself without the extrinsic diversions of the empirical world. However, mind ultimately rises not only above the sensory realm and not only above its own cognitive thought, but also above the realm of art. Ultimately, mind realizes that art has completed its work and dismisses it as superfluous. For art is not an entity that can reflect upon itself. Art acts only in service of the advancement of mind and nothing more. Art cannot in itself be mind and perceive the totality constituted by mind. Similarly, music cannot itself perceive music and be elevated by music. Music and poetry thus reveal themselves as dispensable commodities, crutches that must ultimately be discarded if mind is to achieve its true potential. Hegel said that religious truth also has a potential for liberating mind, given it employs a logic of internal dialectics. However, it too, like art, is limited. In this case, even before mind is ready to achieve emancipation by its dogma, which prevents clarity of understanding, and which is extremely important when there are always so many small children around. Hegel said that, in the end, all must be set aside in the merging of opposites with the subjective mind in the cause of the elevation, the sublation of knowledge. Art and religion and poetry and even music must pass away in the eventual self-realization of mind.
Hegel died in 1831 during a cholera epidemic in Berlin. He was buried next to Fichte, another Jena exile, but his work was certainly not forgotten. Indeed, Hegel was the most significant intellectual in all of German-speaking Europe at the time of his death, and his views continued to be influential for a long time. His ideas were picked up most notably by a group of revolutionary individuals who called themselves the Young Hegelians, who included Ludwig Feuerbach, who lived in Jena at the same time as Hegel, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, who submitted his doctoral thesis to the University of Jena, even though he never lived in the town. Together they seized upon the historical dialectics discussed in Hegel's work, even as they removed the art and religion. They interpreted his work in a thoroughly secular and materialist manner.
The teleological direction of dialectics was no longer oriented on the freedom of absolute mind, but the emancipation from oppression of the burgeoning working classes.
In one sense, Hegel had taken German idealism and the fusion of the subjective and objective proposed by Novalis, Schelling and Goethe to its inevitable conclusion by creating a universal system whereby the equivalences of mind and nature were encompassed by an absolute mind, which comprised of all knowledge and thought. But he'd also left a difficult situation for art and aesthetics, as shown by the response of the young Hegelians. If Kant had elevated aesthetics to a position of mastery, able to unite the cognitive architecture of mind and the faculty of judgment, then Hegel had torn away the foundations. Art was reduced to the level of second-rate contemplation, of use only to those so wholly immersed in the phenomenal world of experience they're unable to appreciate the mind-liberating alternatives. Hegel had said neither art nor religion can reveal the progress of absolute mind and its deep intricacies.
There were many who were deeply offended, none more so than the Danish theologian Søren Kierkegaard, who was inspired to produce speculative work based on irony and metaphor, which was to inspire the 20th century existentialist tradition. Arthur Schopenhauer, an on-and-off Weimar resident himself, was also repulsed. He had detested Hegel and his self-righteous system incorporating absolutely everything, and absolutely everything else too. He'd organised lectures in Berlin at the same time as Hegel's, with the specific intent of drawing away the large crowds, although without much success. Moving into the 20th century, Theodor Adorno was another fervent opponent of Hegelian absolutism. He argued that the illogical nature of dialectic logic was proof enough that logic and reason cannot survive the real world of instrumental explanation. And thereafter, ordinary Oxford language denied the possibility of any kind of universal Hegelian-style metalinguistics able to guide intellectual discourse, even as everybody else complained that Hegel's dialectics was restricted to the mind of a human-centric world, and without any role for the natural world that he claimed to have recuperated.
But since the Second World War, Hegel's work has grown influential once more, and I'd like to use the remainder of this episode for a brief consideration of a few examples of Hegel's continuing legacy today. Existentialism in particular has looked to the historicism and the dialectic passageways to human freedom, and I'll look at some recent French voices who look to these themes later.
Hegel has also been important to many German thinkers, including Alex Honneth in Frankfurt, who has argued that despite our living in a post-metaphysical age, whatever that means, and despite the fact that the Weimar identity thesis comes down to the modern era embroiled in idealistic speculation, a philosophy of consciousness as he calls it, somewhat derogatorily, despite all of these things, Hegelian principles still have much to offer. Indeed, Honneth has tried to build a systematic social theory based explicitly on fragmentary ideas explored by Hegel while writing the Phenomenology of Mind. I mention Honneth's work in particular here because it's also intriguing how he strives to continue the Frankfurt School project of developing social theory while introducing an orientation away from that of economics and the economics of culture, as represented by Marxist thought and the ideas of Adorno. Instead, he's moved the focus to the ethics of community life, which of course is of great interest to me as an international school director, and in particular to situating injustice in violations of moral expectations, which are consistent with the theme of reconciliation that's also encompassed by the Weimar identity thesis.
Another local writer who's been influenced more recently by Hegel is Hans-Georg Gadamer. I have his book Hegel's Dialectics with me now. I'll look at Gadamer's hermeneutics in a later episode, but for now I'd like to draw a comparison with my own music. Before I finish by pulling the work of Hegel and other Weimar idealists together with an amalgamated definition of their approach to metaphysics, I must make a brief tangent to consider music again. In the same way that Gadamer broaches the task of bringing the productive unclarity of dialectical thought to life with all clarity of mind, my third symphony, which I played at the beginning of this episode, seeks to bring the non-cognitive realm of music to the cognitive ideas of various different historical eras.
Each of these hermeneutic encounters and the dialogue that ensues seeks to disclose essential elements of the historical work, which might in turn inform subsequent interpretations of that work. The fourth movement of the symphony looks at how Beethoven in particular, who was Hegel's contemporary, transforms sonata form to the extent that the processes of motivic development overwhelm melodic integrity. Just as in Hegel's dialectics, all arguments and counter-arguments are sublated through organic processes, and mime moves towards the elevated terrain of absolute freedom.
I'll play another passage in a moment to finish this episode, but just before I do that, I want to summarise things so far, and to consider again the orientation map that I presented before, now that I've looked at several of the main contributors to the Weimar tradition.
If I deny the identity of the subject-object as being situated in mind alone, and instead affirm an absolute identity that transcends both and allows for the situation of mind and nature within it, and if I deny that nature is derived from consciousness and instead affirm an autonomous reality with its own mind-independent rationality, and if I deny the Kantian Fichte epistemology that posits the impossibility of such an assertion and instead affirm the possibility of knowledge of an absolute, then I'm ready to join the camp of absolute idealism along with Goethe, Novalis, Schelling and Hegel.
Indeed, the individuals I've looked at did not work in isolation at all. They were all part of a community that engaged in vigorous discourse and shared ideas. Consequently, their achievement is a shared one. The work of Fichte was an early response to the challenge of Kantian transcendentalism, but in the end, the community settled around a version of idealism that incorporated the principle of equivalencies between mind and nature.
So I have a new model based upon the Weimar thesis, which I introduced in the very first episode, and which I shall now call the Weimar identity thesis. It comprises several big ideas. Firstly, that the entity of mind can be identified with the entity that is the totality of nature. Secondly, that the consciousness possessed or perceived by that entity of mind can be identified with the consciousness that is absolute mind. Thirdly, that this identity allows for a reconciliation between the organic evolutionary development of nature and the dialectics of mental transformation. This development is oriented teleologically on complexity in the natural world and the intricacies of autonomous freedom in the realm of mind. And fourthly, that this identity allows for a reconciliation between personal morality and social norms, and between aesthetic judgments and cultural norms.
If I put this in more formal terms, then I might say, it is true that P, if and only if, P expressed in terms of nature is analogous with P expressed in terms of the mind, is true. The if and only if operator in the proposition P if and only if Q allows the inference that if the antecedent P follows from the consequent Q and Q follows from P, then P and Q have material equivalence. They're biconditional. They have the same truth value. For example, from the statements, if my heart is beating, then I'm alive, and if I'm alive, then my heart is beating, it can be inferred that my heart is beating if and only if I'm alive, or I'm alive if and only if my heart is beating. Applying this to the Weimar identity thesis, I can say that the process of sublation obtains if and only if the process of sublation expressed in terms of nature is equivalent or analogous, I'm using these words to mean the same thing, with the process of sublation expressed in terms of the mind. I'll finish with another section from my third symphony, from the fourth movement entitled Of Hegel and Beethoven's Opus 111. Thanks for listening.